Hello. Protection of privacy and confidentiality of research participants is probably one of the most important aspects of any type of biomedical health research, social research, behavioral science research. And in today's session, we will be discussing the requirements to maintain confidentiality and privacy, especially as per the different types of study settings or research topic, and to identify and understand different mechanisms which need to be put into place. Let us understand the definitions first, and this is very important. What do we mean by privacy? Privacy is about the right of an individual to control or influence the information that can be collected or stored. My information, for example, what can you collect and what can you store of my information or my samples or any of this, and who can collect this information, who am I allowing to collect and see this information. That is about my privacy. Who should this investigator not release it to? And therefore privacy pertains to the person. It is about me or you or any individual who is participating in the research, and it is his or her primary right that privacy should be protected. Confidentiality is the extension, and it is actually the obligation of the researcher or the institution or the organization to the participant, the obligation to the participant to safeguard this data or information that is given to them as part of the research, and to protect that information from unauthorized use. That is equally important, and that is the maintenance of confidentiality, and therefore now this confidentiality pertains to the data. This is very important to understand, and the principle of ensuring privacy and confidentiality comes as one of the important 12 principles enumerated in the ICMR guidelines, and says that you must maintain privacy of the potential participant, his or her identity, and keep his records confidential, keep access limited to only those who are authorized. This issue becomes very important when it comes to publicizing the results of the research that is being done. We must ensure, and the researcher must ensure, that the photographs or any other information that may reveal the individual's identity are not published. But if you have to, because sometimes, especially in certain types of congenital malformations, etc., you may need to publish this because otherwise that paper may be inadequate or incomplete. In which case, and even otherwise, even if without publishing the photograph, if details of this case is to be published, a consent should be taken. And if a consent hasn't been taken earlier, a re-consent should be taken specifically for publication. And we have to remember, this is not only for publication of research papers, but also for registries, reports, and presentations at conferences. Remember, the privacy of that individual is most important, crucial, and please do remember that his permission should be there with you to share any data of that patient, and best it be a written consent. Always safeguard the right to privacy of a participant. Whose responsibility it is? Obviously the researchers. It is primarily, above all, the researchers' responsibility to maintain this privacy and confidentiality, but it is also the ethics committee's responsibility to ensure that this investigator does this, and therefore this role doesn't end. The EC needs to review how are they going to document data. Is it going to be done electronically? Will there be an electronic signature? How are they going to ensure that this data is kept private and that the privacy is maintained? For example, even about maintaining privacy, how is consent going to be taken and documented? All these things must be reviewed. After that, how will they keep them secure, this data? It is not possible that the investigator just leaves his documents around so anybody knows who is the patient participating in the study. Where is his privacy then? And of course, the site should have data use policies which the EC should review. I wanted to stress a little on informed consent because there are many issues in informed consent that we must address when we are doing research or when we are reviewing research. and that is about how privacy will be maintained, and this should be maintained at all times. We have AV consent recording as well, and even in this, how do we ensure and how do we keep this privacy, especially access to these AV consent recordings, is something that has to be kept in mind. Another issue that often comes up with consent recording, especially when we're talking about illiterate participants, is about the witness. The witness has to be impartial, remember, and therefore cannot be a member of your team and cannot be a relative of the patient. So it has to be somebody else. We have to respect that the patient needs to be asked, can this person participate in this consent process, because you cannot read, and we need to explain to the patient, because the patient has a right to say no. Because this is about me talking to my doctor, I may be happy to do so because it is about my disorder or something, but if it is a stigmatizing disorder, the patient may not be ready to do so. If it is for example, IV drug users, and these are little children, who is going to be the witness and who is going to be the LAR are issues that really need to be addressed from the point of the privacy of that individual. And how can this be addressed? Both the investigator as well as the EC should look at. If a waiver of consent is given by the ethics committee, the EC always must ensure how privacy and confidentiality will be maintained. When we're looking at special situations like vulnerable populations, the breach of confidentiality, whether it's accidental or usually cannot be intended. So even if it's accidental breach of confidentiality, we must remember that it can enhance vulnerability. And when research is planned on sensitive topics or in sensitive geographic areas, for example, in domestic violence, rape, etc., confidentiality of the data and privacy, more care has to be put into place, more systems, and the EC should review about this whole process, including that of taking consent. And we must show, while reviewing, great sensitivity to the local cultural norms and to the issues that these individuals who are suffering and are going to be part of the research project are to be taken. The EC must also review the risk mitigation strategies. Will there be counseling centers? Will there be protection, police protection, more relevant perhaps to social studies, but these have to be in place. And no information should be acquired also from a person, woman, which may be unnecessary, hurtful, or appear voyeuristic. When genetic research is planned, this is very crucial. The researcher should explain the specific nature of expected results. It is important. The counseling during genetic research is probably the crux of the whole aspect. Just like for when we are doing an HIV testing, the counseling is very important. The patient needs to understand the type of research or the type of test that is being done and what are the implications of the results and whether they want to know the results or not, or if it is some genetic disorder that is being studied which you can do nothing about, they may not want to know, they may not want to participate. All this has to be explained well. You must also explain the need for confidentiality and why this won't be shared with anyone. At the same time, also explain that there may be limitations and there may be occasions when breach of confidentiality may happen, and these have to, we will come to this in due course. But remember that disclosure of the results itself may cause psychosocial harms and therefore needs very, very careful handling and trained individuals. When research is being done on family members of an index case, the consent of each person whom you are going to test must be taken. The researcher cannot reveal any genetic information to anybody unless that person has consented. If the disclosure is absolutely warranted, then the physician may take informed consent from the family member and then inform whoever else they have to inform. If that family member does not consent, then the physician, this is also important, you need to balance the risks of non-disclosure against the breach of confidentiality and take an appropriate decision. Again, it can be taken in association with the ethics committee. Remember, we anonymize data, we store samples, maybe genetics data also, we store it, but we do it where it's coded. But it is possible that afterwards, if you want, you may be able to delink it. That's why anonymization and coding tends to be a way in which you can go back and find out who the person is. But this should be only, the relinking should be done with the approval of the EC if, for example, the result needs to be communicated. The same holds true for anonymization of biological samples, where anonymization helps to minimize the connection between identifiers and stored samples, or medical data for that matter, and maintaining confidentiality of data and respecting the identity of the individual is of prime importance, especially if you're doing large population-based genetic studies. And more care has to be sought, and the EC has to review this when stigmatizing diseases are being studied, or even diseases which themselves may have no known treatment at that time, and further the relatives are to be assessed. And under such circumstances, it is very important that how this confidentiality will be maintained is studied. Identifiability may be retained so that you can allow for later withdrawal of consent, and of course, in such situations, the custodians, you as the investigator or the institutions, have far greater responsibility, because you know that you can trace back to that original person, but the primary principle of maintaining that person's privacy and confidentiality of data has to be supreme and has to be observed. It is very important to remember that the data or the samples actually belong to the participants, and the researcher or the institution is merely a custodian, and therefore in that respect the institution or the researcher should handle the data and maintain again the privacy of the individual. The same holds true for data. Nowadays a large amount of health research, health related data is maintained, is available, and a lot of research is being done on this, and it has led to increasing risks associated with the use, especially of knowing or of revealing identities and lack of confidentiality. Individuals have rights, and these have to be maintained, and if any research protocol comes, this must be reviewed by the ethics committees well. Remember that the EC must look at the physical safety of these devices which are storing this data, password protections, what are being given to ensure that only those who need to, therefore differential and role-based control access, what is the policy of the investigator you may want to look at, and if data is to be transferred, what are the data encryption plans. In case of humanitarian crises and emergency research, one has to remember that there is a disruption of governance and infrastructure, communication breach, and there may be inflow of visitors, and all this can lead to breach of privacy and confidentiality. And if any research is planned, this breach of privacy and confidentiality must be minimized or prevented to the best. In the same way, stigmatization and discrimination must be prevented, and whatever special efforts are needed which are culturally appropriate and scientifically valid should be taken to maintain dignity, privacy and confidentiality of the participants. We did discuss a while ago about limitations to ensure strict confidentiality. It is possible that this may not be possible to maintain strict confidentiality for various reasons. If that is likely to happen, you must inform the researcher right at the outset that we may have to breach your confidentiality of the data for these reasons, for your health reasons, or for society's health reason, or for your spouse's health reasons, or whatever. Then in that case, the patient should know that this is possible. So when does this happen, for example? When is it that privacy and confidentiality has to be breached? It is possible. For example, if a patient is showing suicidal ideation or homicidal tendency or has an HIV positive status, or when required by law, we may have to breach the confidentiality. But if you do have to do this, then you must do this in consultation with the ethics committee for valid reasons, both scientific or legal. And remember one thing, and this is the bottom line, that the right to life of an individual supersedes the right to privacy of the research participant. For example, while you're doing a routine research, you discover that your research participant is HIV positive. Then the right to life of that person's sexual partner supersedes the right to privacy of this individual, and therefore first and foremost you have to communicate with that patient, but ultimately it is important that the partner whose life may be endangered needs to understand, and therefore this right to life is something that has to be remembered. Thank you.